I remember the bells most vividly, not as grand, silent statues now, but as living voices that once pulsed through the very stones of Oakhaven. My name is Thomas, and when I was a boy, no older than 10, the world was a tapestry woven with the threads of sound, and the loudest, most vibrant thread was always the tolling of St. Peter's. They were not merely instruments of time, marking the hours or calling us to worship. They were the very heartbeat of our village, dictating the rhythm of our lives from dawn's first pale blush to the deep indigo of night. I've heard grown men speak of the bells as if they had a soul, and truly, for us, they did. My earliest memory is not of my mother's lullabies, nor the rumble of my father's wagon, but of the deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards of our cottage, coaxing me from slumber each morning. It was the 6 o'clock chime, a solemn yet comforting declaration that a new day had begun. The sound would ripple through the valley, stirring the mists from the river and rousing the chickens from their roosts. Father, a man of few words but tireless hands, would already be up, the aroma of brewing coffee and baking bread filling our small kitchen. But it was the bells that truly signaled the start of his work on the fields, and mine, in my small way, helping him. Their echo would cling to the air long after the last vibration had faded, a lingering warmth that promised another day of sun and toil. The clang of them at noon was different, a sharper, more urgent call, scattering the pigeons from the belfry and sending the children, myself included, scurrying home from our play. It meant a brief respite, a moment to sit together around the sturdy wooden table, sharing bread and cheese, perhaps a little pickled herring. Mother, her hands perpetually dusted with flour from the bakery she ran from our home, would often remark, "The bells are hungry today, Thomas. Best eat up." And we would, listening to the fading echo, a reminder that the afternoon's tasks awaited. I particularly loved the noon bells because they meant a temporary reprieve from my chores, usually spent weeding the stubborn rows of potatoes, a task I found mind-numbingly dull. The sound was a liberation, a sudden burst of freedom before the inevitable return to the earth. But it was the evening bells, the ones that pealed at 6 and then softly at 9, that held a special magic. The 6 o'clock chime meant the day's labor was largely done, the tools laid down, and the smell of wood smoke from countless chimneys beginning to mingle with the scent of damp earth and evening dew. It was the signal for men to gather at the tavern, for women to share stories over their mending, and for children like me to chase fireflies in the deepening twilight. The 9 o'clock bell, though, was a lullaby in its own right. It was a gentle, insistent murmur, a signal for all of Oakhaven to retreat into the quiet embrace of their homes. As I lay in my narrow bed, the last faint vibrations would drift through my open window, mixing with the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves, lulling me into a dream-filled sleep. The bells felt like a protective presence, a watchful guardian over our small, peaceful corner of the world. Our village, Oakhaven, was nestled deep within a valley, cradled by rolling hills that seemed to cup the sound of the bells, preventing it from escaping too quickly. St. Peter's itself stood on a small rise, its stone facade weathered by centuries of wind and rain, its spire reaching like a prayer towards the heavens. The belfry, a dark, gaping maw high above, was a mystery to me, a place only the bellmaster, old Master Ilara, ever dared to enter. He was a stoic, silver-haired man, his hands gnarled from years of pulling the heavy ropes, his ears, I imagined, attuned to every nuance of their voices. He spoke of the bells as his children, each with a distinct personality, a unique tone. There was Gabriel, the largest, with a deep, booming voice that shook the ground, Michael, sharper and clearer, and the smaller, sweeter-toned ones, Uriel and Raphael, who sang the lighter notes. Together they formed a choir, a symphony orchestrated by Master Elara's expert touch. Life in Oakhaven was simple, predictable, and deeply rooted in tradition. The year revolved not just around the seasons, but around the special occasions marked by the bells. They pealed with jubilant enthusiasm for weddings, their merry cadence echoing the laughter and dancing in the village square. They tolled with a slow, mournful lament for funerals, their sorrowful notes hanging heavy in the air, a shared embrace of grief. They rang out with fervent joy on feast days, announcing the arrival of spring or the bounty of the harvest. Their sound urging us to gather, to celebrate, to give thanks. Each ring, each chime, each peal was a thread in the collective memory of Oakhaven, weaving our stories, our joys, and our sorrows into an unbreakable fabric. The sound of the bells was synonymous with life itself, with the passage of time, with every significant moment that shaped us. I remember once, during a particularly harsh winter, when the snow lay thick and unforgiving, Master Elara had fallen ill, and for a day the morning bells did not ring. The silence was deafening, a palpable void that settled over the village. It was as if the very air had lost its breath. People walked with a strange hesitancy, their conversations muted, their faces etched with a quiet unease. It was only when Master Elara, pale but determined, managed to pull himself to the belfry the next morning that the world righted itself. The first resonant thrum of Gabriel, followed by the others, brought a collective sigh of relief, a communal feeling of normalcy restored. That day, I understood, even as a child, how deeply embedded the bells were in the very soul of Oakhaven, how their absence could render our world mute and disoriented. The stability they offered was not merely temporal, it was emotional, spiritual. They were our connection to the past, the same bells that had rung for my grandparents and their grandparents before them. They were our anchor in the present, guiding our days. And implicitly, they were our promise for the future, a sound that would greet new generations as it had greeted ours. We never questioned their presence, never imagined a time when their voices might be stilled. They were as fundamental as the river that flowed through our valley, as constant as the sun that rose over the eastern hills. But even as a boy, a vague sense of unease, like a distant rumble of thunder on a clear day, had begun to stir. It was not a sound I could pinpoint, but a change in the adults' faces, a hushed quality to their conversations, a new tension in the way they held themselves. Whispers of things from beyond our valley, from the larger world, began to drift in on the merchant wagons that occasionally passed through Oakhaven. Words like decree, levies, and unrest were murmured, their meanings opaque to my young mind, but their implications clear in the furrowed brows of my father, and the worried glances exchanged between the women. The bells continued their solemn duty, day in and day out, oblivious, it seemed, to the subtle shift in the wind. But I, a boy whose world was defined by their steadfast rhythm, felt a tremor, a faint discord in the familiar harmony. It was a premonition, though I didn't know it then, of the profound, aching silence that was destined to descend upon St. Peter's, a silence that would swallow their voices whole, never to be rung again. The whispers grew louder, like the rustling of dry leaves before a storm. They spoke of a king, far from our valley, who sought to centralize all power, to strip away the old ways, the traditions that had bound our communities for centuries. To a boy like me, such talk was abstract, the concerns of men with beards and calloused hands, but the fear in their eyes was not. It etched lines around my father's mouth and deepened the shadows under my mother's eyes. The merchants, usually jovial and full of tales from distant lands, now arrived with grim faces, their voices lowered, their goods less plentiful. They brought not just cloth and salt, but news of distant villages whose bells had already fallen, silent not through illness or disrepair, but by decree. The very thought was a chill that crept into my bones, a concept so alien it was almost unimaginable. How could a king, so far away, command the silence of our bells? One crisp autumn morning, a contingent of royal soldiers arrived in Oakhaven. Their armor, though dusty from the journey, gleamed in the sunlight, and the sharp clang of their boots on the cobblestones was a sound utterly foreign to our peaceful village. They were led by a man with a stern face and an even sterner voice, who introduced himself as Commander Thorn. He bore a royal seal, a decree from the king himself, announcing new taxes, new laws, and most unsettling of all, a mandate regarding the village churches and their bells. My father stood among the men of Oakhaven, his shoulders set, his jaw tight, as Commander Thorn's words echoed through the stunned silence of the square. The bells, he declared, were to be silenced, their metal repurposed for the king's military endeavors. A single unified time was to be established, dictated by royal clocks, not the varied ancient voices of individual churches. A gasp went through the crowd. Women clutched their children closer, and men exchanged horrified glances. Master Elara, who had stood slightly apart, his gaze fixed on his beloved belfry, took a step forward. His voice, usually quiet, now held a tremor of outrage. "Sir," he began, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn rope that hung by the church door, "the bells of St. Peter's have rung for generations. They are the voice of our village, our history, our very souls." Commander Thorn merely raised an imperious hand. "Tradition is a luxury, old man, in these changing times. The king's will is absolute. These bells will serve a higher purpose now, the defense of the realm." He ordered his men to begin the preparations for their removal. The air grew, heavy with a mixture of disbelief and a nascent, unfamiliar anger. We had always been a peaceable village, our disputes settled with words, our lives governed by the seasons and the bells. This was an invasion, not with swords and fire, but with decrees and silence. The soldiers, impassive and efficient, began to set up their scaffolding around the church spire. The scraping of wood against stone, the harsh commands of the soldiers, the clang of their tools. These were the new, unwelcome sounds that replaced the familiar comfort of the bells. The very thought of those majestic voices being melted down, transformed into weapons of war, was a sacrilege that turned my stomach. For the next few days, a suffocating despair settled over Oakhaven. The laughter of children was muted, the usual, chatter of neighbors replaced by hushed conversations and sighs. My mother moved through our cottage with a heavy heart, her baking losing some of its usual warmth. My father spent longer hours in the fields, his back straighter, his movements more deliberate, as if trying to outrun the inevitable. I saw Master Elara each day, a spectral figure standing vigil beneath the belfry, his eyes fixed on the bells that were slowly, inexorably, being dismantled. He looked like a man watching his own children being taken from him, and the sight was more heartbreaking than any lament. I remember seeing him one afternoon, his hand resting on the cold, ancient stone of the church, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. It was the first time I had ever seen Master Elara weep, and it solidified the dread in my own young heart. The village elders, usually the picture of stoic wisdom, held desperate, lengthy meetings in the common hall. They sent emissaries to the commander, pleading, offering silver, even proposing to pay the new taxes immediately, if only the bells could be spared. But Commander Thorn was unyielding. "The king's word is law," he repeated, a mantra of unfeeling authority. There was no room for negotiation, no space for sentimentality. The king's decree was to be executed, and the bells of St. Peter's were destined for the forge. It was during one of these somber afternoons that I had an idea, born of desperation and the boundless hope of a child. I watched Master Elara, his back bowed, slowly make his way from the church. I knew, with a certainty that only a child possesses, that he loved those bells more than anything. I followed him, a small shadow in the deepening gloom, until he reached his small cottage on the edge of the village. I found him seated by the dying embers of his fireplace, staring into the flames as if searching for answers in their dance. "Master Ilara," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. He looked up, his eyes clouded with a sorrow I had never seen before. "What is it, Thomas?" he asked, his voice raspy. "The bells," I began, my heart pounding in my chest. Can't we hide them?" A flicker, a spark of something unreadable crossed his face. He looked at me, truly looked at me for a long moment, as if seeing not just a boy, but a glimmer of something he had lost. He sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "They are too large, Thomas, too heavy. Where would we hide them from the king's men? And even if we could, who would ring them then? The king's decree forbids it." But what if we only hid one?" I persisted, the thought forming more clearly in my mind. "Just one, Master Ilara, so that its voice, even a whisper, can still be heard in Oakhaven. Not for time or for feasts, but just for us, for remembrance." He looked at me again, his gaze lingering on my earnest face. The idea, born of a child's simple logic, resonated with something deep within him, a refusal to let go of everything. He knew the futility of fighting the king's men directly, but perhaps, just perhaps, a small act of defiance, a quiet preservation, was possible. He rose slowly, his gaze drifting towards the belfry, where the soldiers continued their work, their figures silhouetted against the darkening sky. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Which one, Thomas?" he asked, his voice, softer now, tinged with a rekindled hope. "Which bell would you save?" I didn't hesitate. "Uriel," I said immediately. Uriel, the smallest, the sweetest, the one whose clear, gentle chime was often overshadowed by the booming voices of Gabriel and Michael, yet held a tender beauty all its own. Its removal, I reasoned, would be less noticeable, perhaps even mistaken, for part of the general dismantling. And so, a quiet conspiracy began to take root in the heart of Oakhaven, a desperate, last-ditch effort to preserve a sliver of our soul. It was a secret born of sorrow and a fragile hope, a dangerous act of defiance against a powerful kingdom, but one we felt compelled to undertake. The stakes were high, but the thought of a truly silent Oakhaven, a world devoid of the bells, comforting embrace, was a fate too terrible to contemplate. We knew it would not be easy, and the risks were immense, but the silence, the impending absolute silence, was a heavier burden than any danger. The village, having faced the grim reality of Commander Thorne's intent, now clung to this desperate, improbable hope. We began to watch the soldiers, studying their routines, their breaks, their moments of inattention, knowing that our only chance lay in a fleeting window of opportunity. The air crackled with a new tension, a grim determination that had replaced the earlier despair, a feeling that even a boy could sense. The weight of the secret, the shared knowledge of our audacious plan, settled over Oakhaven like a shroud, yet beneath it, a tiny flame of defiance flickered. Master Ilara and my father, men of quiet strength, became the core of our small conspiracy. They chose a handful of others, men whose loyalty to the bells was as unshakable as their faith. Old Silas, the blacksmith, whose hands could coax iron into submission, young Finn, quick and agile, who knew every shadow and shortcut in the village, and Martha, the baker's wife, whose sharp mind and even sharper tongue made her an invaluable lookout. I, too, was included, not for my strength, but for my small size and keen eyes, able to slip unseen where larger men could not. The meetings were hushed, held in the deepest hours of the night, by the dying embers of Master Alara's hearth, or, in the shadowed corner of Silas's smithy, the rhythmic clink of his hammer serving as a deceptive background noise. The plan was simple in its audacity, complex in its execution. Uriel, though the smallest of the bells, was still a formidable weight of bronze, taller than any man, and requiring immense leverage to move. The soldiers, focused on the larger, more visible bells, often left the scaffolding near Uriel's perch, less guarded, assuming its lesser value made it less of a target for theft, or perhaps simply less of a priority in their dismantling schedule. Our window of opportunity, we decided, would be during the soldiers' supper break, when their attention was diverted to their rations and their loud boasts filled the common hall. Finn would create a diversion on the far side of the village, a small, controlled fire in an abandoned shed, just enough to draw attention without causing real harm. Martha would be positioned near the church gate, knitting innocently, her eyes and ears alert to any deviation from the soldiers' routine. My father and Silas would be responsible for the bell's descent. They had devised a system of ropes and pulleys, using the existing framework within the belfry and some additional sturdy timbers smuggled from our own woodshed. Master Alara, despite his frail health, insisted on being at the very top, his knowledge of the bell's inner workings paramount. My role was to remain hidden within the church, near the great oak doors, ready to open them at the precise moment Uriel was lowered, then to help guide it onto a concealed handcart. The hiding place? A forgotten crypt beneath the church, long, sealed and supposedly haunted, a place the soldiers would never think to search. We spent days preparing, practicing the movements, whispering instructions, each of us feeling the immense weight of the task and the dire consequences of failure. The night of the first attempt was a moonless canvas of black. A thick fog had rolled in from the river, muffling sounds and obscuring vision, a blessing and a curse. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slipped into the cold, silent church. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient dust. I could hear the faint murmur of the soldiers' voices from the common hall, a low, guttural hum that was both distant and terrifyingly close. From above, I heard the creak of the ropes, the muffled thud of Silas's large hands on the wood, and Master Alara's soft, urgent whispers. Then, Finn's signal, a faint, acrid smell of smoke drifting through the open doors, followed by the shouts of the soldiers as they rushed towards the far side of the village. This was it. But the fog, our ally, proved also to be our undoing. As my father and Silas began to lower Uriel, the ropes, slick with moisture, slipped. The bell jolted, scraping loudly against the stone frame of the belfry. The sound, amplified in the still night, was like a thunderclap, a sudden sharp shout from the churchyard, one of the soldiers, perhaps returning early or simply on patrol, had heard it. "Halt! Who goes there?" My father, quick as lightning, threw his weight against the rope, halting Uriel's descent. Master Alara hissed an order to abandon the attempt. We froze, suspended in the agonizing silence, listening to the crunch of boots approaching the church. My father gestured frantically for me to hide. I scrambled behind a heavy wooden pew, my breath catching in my throat, praying to all the saints that the darkness would consume me. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. A moment of unbearable tension stretched. Then the soldier grumbled something about rats and the fog playing tricks, before moving on. The immediate danger passed, but the attempt was abandoned. We dispersed like shadows, the bitter taste of failure in our mouths. A week passed. The dismantling continued, the belfry becoming emptier by the day. The large bells, Gabriel and Michael, were already on the ground awaiting transport, their once proud voices now mute hulks of metal. Despair threatened to engulf us again, but Master Alara, though visibly weaker, refused to yield. "We will try again," he declared, his voice thin but resolute. Tonight, the same plan, but with greater caution. This time, Silas had soaked the ropes in a mixture of resin and sand, hoping to improve their grip. My father had reinforced the pulley system, and Finn had found a more remote, yet equally distracting location for his diversion. The second night was clearer, but a biting wind swept through the valley, making the cold more intense. This time there was no hesitation, only grim determination. I waited by the church doors, my hands clammy. I heard Finn's signal, a muffled cry from the distance, followed by the familiar shouts of the soldiers. Up above, the creak of ropes was fainter, more controlled. Then a low, sustained groan as Uriel began its slow, agonizing descent. It moved with excruciating slowness, a majestic bronze tear falling from the church's eye. My father and Silas grunted with effort, their muscles straining, their faces bathed in sweat despite the cold. Master Alara, his silhouette against the faint starlight, guided the ropes with uncanny precision. Finally, with a soft, muffled thud, Uriel landed on the thick blankets we had laid out. The clang of metal against stone, which had caused us such terror before, was now a quiet whisper. I threw open the church doors just enough for them to carefully maneuver the bell onto the handcart. The sheer weight was astonishing. Even on wheels, it felt like moving a mountain. We worked in silent unison, our breaths misting in the cold air. The only sound the faint squeak of the cart's wheels as we pushed Uriel through the church nave, past the pews that had once vibrated with its song. We reached the crypt entrance, hidden beneath a loose flagstone near the altar. It was a dark, musty space, filled with the scent of damp earth and forgotten history. With a final surge of strength, we pushed Uriel into its dark sanctuary. The bell settled with a final echoing thud, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very ground. We quickly replaced the flagstone, wiping away any trace of our disturbance. A moment of profound silence followed, not the oppressive silence of dread, but a silence pregnant with a desperate victory. Uriel was safe. The next morning, the remaining bells were taken. Gabriel, Michael, and Raphael were hauled out of the church, their massive forms looking pitifully small and vulnerable on the king's wagons. The belfry, once a proud, echoing mouth, was now a gaping, empty maw against the sky. The soldiers dismantled their scaffolding and rode away, their mission accomplished, oblivious to the secret that pulsed beneath the ancient stones of St. Peter's. A true silence, absolute and chilling, descended upon Oakhaven. There were no bells to mark the morning, no joyful peals for the sun's zenith, no comforting chimes to usher in the night. Yet, for those of us who knew, a tiny, defiant voice still lingered, a promise hidden in the dark, silent heart of the crypt. Emptiness in the belfry was a wound, but the knowledge of Uriel's presence was a balm, a private comfort in the oppressive quiet. The days that followed the departure of the king's soldiers were draped in an unnatural quiet. Oakhaven, once a vibrant tapestry of sound woven with the daily rhythm of St. Peter's bells, was now a muted, colorless landscape. The morning sun still climbed over the eastern hills, but there was no resonant chime to greet it, no 6 o'clock call to stir the village. My father still rose before dawn, but his movements were slower, his usually sharp commands to me softened by a lingering sadness. Mother's baking still filled our cottage with the comforting scent of fresh bread, but the joyful hum that often accompanied her work was gone, replaced by a quiet sigh. The very air felt heavier, thicker with the unspoken grief of a community that had lost its voice. For a boy who had known nothing but the constant companionship of the bells, this silence was a physical ache. It was like waking up to find a limb missing, a phantom sensation of something vital that should be there, but wasn't. The emptiness of the belfry was a constant, stark reminder, a dark hole against the blue sky where a proud voice once stood. I would often gaze at it, a knot tightening in my stomach, remembering the majestic swing of Gabriel, the sharper arc of Michael, and the delicate dance of Uriel. Now, only the wind whistled through the empty arches, a mournful, hollow sound that echoed the emptiness in our hearts. The absence of the bells disrupted everything. Time, once clearly delineated by their chimes, became fluid and confusing. Farmers would squint at the sun, trying to guess the hour for their lunch break, often returning to the fields late or early. Children, myself included, no longer knew when to scamper home from play, relying instead on the distant, less reliable shadows cast by the afternoon sun. Even the flow of conversations in the village square seemed to falter, lacking the punctuation marks that the bells had once provided. There was a hesitancy, a loss of communal rhythm. It was as if the village had suddenly forgotten how to breathe in unison. Master Ilara, though he carried the secret of Uriel like a precious hidden ember, bore the public silence with profound dignity. He continued his duties at the church, tending to the small garden, sweeping the nave, his movements slow and deliberate. But his eyes, once alight with the knowing wisdom of the bellmaster, now held a deep, unyielding sorrow. He would often sit on the worn stone bench outside the church, his gaze fixed on the empty belfry, his hands resting on his knees, as if still feeling the ghost of the ropes he had pulled for decades. I often saw villagers approach him, offering words of comfort, but he would only nod, his lips pressed into a thin line, the weight of their collective loss, and his own secret heavy upon him. The knowledge that Uriel was still there, hidden, beneath our feet, was a strange comfort. It was a secret shared only by a handful of us, a fragile thread of hope in a world plunged into silence. Sometimes, when the village was quiet and the evening shadows stretched long, I would sneak into the church, my heart thumping against my ribs. I would place my hand on the cold flagstone that concealed the crypt entrance, imagining Uriel beneath, silent but present, a dormant heart waiting for the day it might beat again. It was a defiant thought, a small rebellion against the king's decree, and it gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. It was a desperate hope, almost certainly futile, but for a child, hope was a powerful, necessary thing in the face of such overwhelming despair. But even this solace was tinged with worry. Commander Thorne and his soldiers had left, but the king's authority remained. Periodically, royal couriers would pass through Oakhaven, carrying new decrees, new taxes, their presence a stark reminder of the power that had stolen our bells. We knew that if our secret was discovered, the consequences would be severe, not just for us, but for the entire village. The thought was a chilling wind that swept through my mind, especially at night when shadows played tricks and every rustle outside sounded like approaching footsteps. My parents, though they never spoke of it directly, carried the same burden. Their glances were more frequent, their touch more reassuring, as if to ward off the unspoken fear. Life in Oakhaven became a lesson in adaptation. We learned to tell time by the sun's height, by the lengthening shadows, by the growling of our own stomachs. We gathered for celebrations, but the joy felt somehow muted without the jubilant peals. We mourned our dead, but the sorrow felt heavier, more solitary, without the solemn tolling that had once bound us together in grief. The community, once so openly connected by the bells, began to find new ways to communicate, relying more on direct conversation, on shared glances, on the quiet understanding that passed between us. It was a quiet resilience, a stubborn refusal to be completely broken by the king's command. Yet a subtle resentment began to fester. The king, who had once been a distant, almost mythical figure, now became the embodiment of the silence that had befallen us. His name was whispered with a bitterness that was new to Oakhaven. The men, once quick to dismiss talk of rebellion, now listened with more attentive ears when visiting merchants spoke of other villages that resisted, of underground networks, of whispers of a larger movement. My father, who had always preached caution and obedience, would now occasionally clench his fists when the king's name was mentioned, a flicker of something fierce in his eyes. I recall one particularly cold winter's day. A blizzard had struck, trapping us in our homes, and for 3 days, no one could venture out. When the snow finally cleared, a deep silence still lay over the village. It wasn't just the absence of bells, but the muffling effect of the snow, the quietude of a world blanketed in white. That morning, I saw Master Alara making his way towards the church, his silhouette stark against the glistening snow. He walked, slowly, leaning heavily on his staff, and for the first time, I noticed how truly old he had become. I followed him, curious. He didn't go inside, but instead stood before the empty belfry, reaching up as if to touch something that was no longer there. He closed his eyes and a single profound sigh escaped his lips. Then he began to hum. It was a low, resonant sound, a melody I recognized instantly, the solemn tune the bells would play on the eve of a solemn feast. His voice was cracked with age, but imbued with an incredible tenderness. As he hummed, I imagined the bells, Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, and even hidden Uriel joining in, their voices rising in a magnificent, unseen chorus, echoing through the snow-laden air, filling the silent valley with their ghostly song. It was a poignant moment, a testament to the enduring spirit of Master Alara and the indelible mark the bells had left on our souls. It was a reminder that while the physical bells were gone, their music, their memory, could never truly be silenced. This small private act of remembrance was a powerful statement against the king's tyranny, a defiant whisper in the face of an enforced quiet. The profound impact of the bells was not merely in their sound, but in the life they had woven, the memories they had forged, and the hope they now represented in their hidden, quiet presence.